The knock on my door came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in November, and I knew before I even looked through the peephole that it was my mother-in-law, Patricia. Her perfectly manicured finger was already jabbing the doorbell repeatedly, creating that shrill sound that had haunted my nightmares for the past 8 years. But this time was different. This time, I had something she didn't know about, something that would change everything between us forever. You see, 3 months earlier, I had quietly purchased the Victorian house she'd been living in rent-free since her divorce, the same house where she'd hosted family dinners for years while deliberately excluding me. The same house where she'd built her little kingdom of control and manipulation. And tonight, she was about to discover that her worthless daughter-in-law was now her landlord. But let me back up and tell you how I got here, because this story doesn't start with triumph. It starts with humiliation. 8 years ago, when I married David, I thought I was gaining a family. I was 24, fresh out of college with my business degree, and naive enough to believe that love could conquer all family dysfunction. David had warned me about his mother, describing her as particular and set in her ways, but nothing could have prepared me for Patricia Hoffman. She was a woman who wielded emotional manipulation like a surgeon wields a scalpel, precise, calculated, and devastating. From the moment I walked into that first family gathering, she made it crystal clear that I would never be good enough for her precious son. The way she looked at me, with those cold blue eyes that seemed to catalog every flaw, every imperfection, every reason why I didn't belong in their upper-middle-class bubble. The pattern started immediately after our wedding. Every family gathering became an exercise in psychological warfare, with Patricia as the general commanding her troops. Sunday dinners were mandatory, she declared, but somehow I was always assigned to bring paper plates while David's sister brought the expensive wine. Holiday celebrations were family only, which apparently didn't include wives who hadn't been born into the Hoffman bloodline. When I'd show up anyway, because David insisted, I'd find myself relegated to the children's table or asked to help in the kitchen while everyone else socialized. The message was clear: you're here on sufferance, and don't you forget it. I remember one particular Thanksgiving when I spent 4 hours preparing my grandmother's famous sweet potato casserole, only to watch Patricia dump it directly into the garbage disposal while commenting loudly about how some people just don't understand family traditions. The financial attacks were the worst part, though. Patricia had this way of making comments about money that were designed to cut deep while maintaining plausible deniability. She'd mention how expensive David's education had been, how much she'd sacrificed as a single mother, how worried she was about his future financial security. The implication was always the same: I was a gold digger who had trapped her son before he could find someone more suitable. Never mind that I had my own career in marketing, that I'd paid off my student loans by myself, that I contributed equally to our household expenses. In Patricia's narrative, I was nothing more than a pretty face with dollar signs in my eyes, and she made sure everyone in the family understood that version of reality. What made it worse was how David responded to his mother's behavior. He could see that I was hurt. He knew that her treatment of me was unfair, but he'd grown up under her thumb and couldn't seem to break free from her control. "That's just how she is," became his standard response whenever I tried to talk about it. "She'll come around eventually," he'd promise, but eventually never came. Instead, the situation got progressively worse as Patricia realized that her subtle manipulations weren't driving me away. She began to escalate, finding new ways to exclude me, humiliate me, and make it clear that I would never be welcome in her version of the Hoffman family tree. The woman actually kept a photo album of family memories that didn't include a single picture of me, despite 8 years of marriage to her son. The breaking point came last month at what was supposed to be our final family dinner at Patricia's house. She'd been living in this beautiful Victorian home since her divorce 15 years ago, a house that had belonged to David's late grandfather and had somehow ended up in her possession despite not technically being hers legally. The family had always assumed she owned it, and she never corrected that assumption, using the impressive property as a symbol of her status and authority within the family hierarchy. That night, she announced to the entire table that Thanksgiving would be immediate family only this year, and when David asked what that meant, she looked directly at me and said, "Well, David, I think you know what I mean. Some people just don't understand what family means to us." The silence that followed was deafening, and I realized that after 8 years of trying to prove myself worthy of inclusion, I was finally ready to stop begging for acceptance from someone who would never give it. What Patricia didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been quietly building something while she was busy tearing me down. My marketing career had taken off in ways that surprised even me. 3 years ago, I'd started my own digital marketing consultancy, and it had grown from a side hustle into a 6-figure business with major corporate clients. While Patricia was making snide comments about my little job and how I probably couldn't even balance a checkbook, I was managing multi-million-dollar advertising campaigns and building a reputation in the industry. David knew I was doing well, but even he didn't fully understand the scope of my success. I'd learned early in our marriage to downplay my achievements around his family, because every promotion, every raise, every professional victory was somehow twisted into evidence of my selfishness or neglect of proper wifely duties. The real revelation came 6 months ago when I was having lunch with my attorney, Margaret Chin, who happened to mention some interesting property records she'd discovered while researching another case. Patricia's Victorian house, the one she'd been using as her throne for 15 years, had actually been tied up in a complex estate dispute after David's grandfather died. The property had eventually been sold to pay off debts and legal fees, but somehow Patricia had convinced everyone that she'd inherited it. In reality, she'd been renting it from a property management company that had purchased it from the estate. Margaret's eyes lit up when she told me this, because she knew exactly what I was thinking. The property had recently come back on the market when the management company decided to liquidate their residential holdings. And yes, I could absolutely afford to buy it. The purchase process took 2 months of careful maneuvering. I used a shell company to make the offer, ensuring that Patricia would never connect the sale to me. The asking price was $485,000, which I paid in cash, something that would have shocked David's entire family if they'd known I had that kind of liquid capital. Patricia had no idea that her living situation had changed hands. The property management company had simply informed her that she had a new landlord and that someone would be in touch about the lease terms. She probably assumed it was just another faceless corporation. Little did she know that her new landlord was the woman she'd spent 8 years calling worthless, lazy, and financially dependent. But buying the house was just the beginning. I spent the next month researching everything I could about Patricia's financial situation, and what I discovered was fascinating. Despite all her talk about family money and inherited wealth, despite the expensive clothes and the condescending attitude about financial responsibility, Patricia was barely scraping by. Her alimony had ended 3 years ago, she had no substantial savings, and her part-time job at an art gallery barely covered her basic expenses. The only reason she could afford to live in that beautiful Victorian house was because she'd been paying significantly below market rent to the previous management company. Now that I owned the property, I had some decisions to make about what kind of landlord I wanted to be. The harassment escalated dramatically after that final dinner invitation debacle. Patricia began calling David almost daily, filling his head with poison about how I was changing him and driving a wedge between him and his family. She started showing up at our apartment unannounced, always with some emergency that required David's immediate attention. She'd call during our date nights, interrupt our weekend plans, and find ways to insert herself into every aspect of our lives. The woman actually started sending David job listings for positions in other cities, claiming she was just trying to help him find better opportunities while making comments about how a change of scenery might help him remember what really matters. The manipulation was so blatant that even David started to see through it, but by then the damage to our relationship was becoming harder to ignore. The final straw came when Patricia organized a family reunion and invited everyone except me. She sent out beautiful, formal invitations to aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends for a weekend celebration at her house, making sure to emphasize that it would be a chance for everyone to reconnect without outside distractions. When David received his invitation and realized I hadn't gotten one, he called his mother to clarify. Her response was chilling in its casualness. "Oh, David, you know this is for real family members only. Sarah can find something else to do that weekend. Maybe she can visit her own family and give you some space to remember who you really are." That night, David came home devastated, finally understanding the full extent of his mother's cruelty. But I wasn't devastated anymore. I was ready to show Patricia Hoffman exactly who she'd been underestimating all these years. The morning after Patricia's family reunion invitation fiasco, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and made the phone call that would change everything. I dialed the number for Patricia's house, technically my house now, and listened to it ring 3 times before her familiar voice answered with that artificially sweet tone she used when she didn't recognize the caller ID. "Patricia Hoffman speaking," she said, and I could practically hear the smile she was forcing into her voice. I took a deep breath and said, "Mrs. Hoffman, this is Sarah Mitchell from Mitchell Property Holdings. I'm calling regarding your rental property at 1247 Maple Street. We need to discuss some changes to your lease agreement." The silence that followed was so complete I thought the call had dropped until I heard her sharp intake of breath. "I'm sorry, who is this?" Patricia's voice had lost all its artificial sweetness, replaced by the ice-cold tone I knew so well. I repeated my introduction, explaining that I represented the new ownership of her property and that we needed to schedule a meeting to discuss her tenancy status. What I didn't tell her was that Sarah Mitchell was my maiden name, and Mitchell Property Holdings was the LLC I'd created specifically for this purchase. Her confusion was palpable as she tried to process this information. "But I've been living here for 15 years, she protested. "There must be some mistake. This house belongs to my family." I let her flounder for a moment before calmly explaining that property records showed she was indeed a tenant, not an owner, and that her previous lease agreement had expired. "We'll need to meet in person to discuss your options moving forward," I told her, my voice professionally neutral. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 p.m., and I spent the intervening days preparing meticulously. I had Margaret review all the legal documents, ensuring everything was perfectly legitimate and ironclad. I researched comparable rental properties in the area and discovered that Patricia had been paying about $1,200 per month for a house that should have been renting for at least $2,800. The previous management company had clearly been operating at a loss, which explained why they'd been so eager to sell. I also had a thorough inspection done, documenting several maintenance issues that Patricia had apparently been ignoring, including some significant problems with the heating system and outdated electrical work that needed immediate attention. When Thursday arrived, I dressed in my most professional business attire, a sharp navy blue suit that I'd bought for client presentations, paired with the pearl earrings David had given me for our anniversary. I wanted to look every inch the successful businesswoman that Patricia had always insisted I could never be. I arrived at the house, my house, at exactly 2 p.m. and rang the doorbell. When Patricia opened the door, her face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if the situation hadn't been so serious. First confusion, then recognition, then a kind of horrified understanding as the pieces began falling into place. She whispered, and I could see her mind racing to comprehend what was happening. Hello, Patricia, I said calmly, holding up my leather portfolio. I believe we have an appointment to discuss your lease situation. She stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, her usually perfect composure cracking as she processed the reality of her situation. Finally, she stepped aside to let me in, and I walked into the living room where I'd been excluded from so many family gatherings. The irony wasn't lost on me as I settled into the expensive leather chair she'd never allowed me to sit in before. Would you like some tea? She asked automatically, her social conditioning kicking in even as her world was falling apart around her. That won't be necessary, I replied, opening my portfolio and spreading the documents across her coffee table. We have quite a bit to discuss. The look on Patricia's face when she saw the property deed with my name on it was absolutely priceless. Her carefully constructed mask of aristocratic superiority crumbled completely, replaced by raw shock and something that looked almost like fear. This is impossible, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You can't afford something like this. You work in marketing. I smiled calmly and pulled out a second set of documents, the financial records showing my company's revenue over the past 3 years, along with my personal assets and credit score. Actually, Patricia, I think you'll find that I can afford quite a lot. You've spent 8 years assuming you knew who I was, but you never bothered to actually find out. The power dynamic in that room had shifted so completely that I could practically feel the earth moving beneath our feet. For the first time in our relationship, Patricia Hoffman was the one who felt small and powerless, and I was the one holding all the cards. The silence that followed my revelation stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Patricia's hands were actually shaking as she reached for the documents, her manicured fingers trembling as she tried to process what she was seeing. This can't be real, she kept muttering, flipping through page after page of legal documents, financial statements, and property records. There has to be some mistake. Some kind of fraud. I leaned back in her expensive leather chair, my expensive leather chair now, and watched her world crumble with a sense of satisfaction I hadn't expected to feel. There's no mistake, Patricia. I've owned this house for 3 months now. Every family dinner you've hosted, every cruel comment you've made about my finances, every time you've treated me like I don't belong here, you've been doing it in my house. The transformation was remarkable to witness. This woman who had spent 8 years making me feel small and worthless was suddenly scrambling to understand how she'd so completely misjudged the situation. But you never said anything, she whispered, and for the first time, I heard genuine vulnerability in her voice. You let me believe. I let you believe exactly what you wanted to believe, I interrupted, my voice steady and calm. You were so convinced that I was nothing more than a gold-digging nobody that you never bothered to actually look at who I really am or what I've accomplished. You saw what you expected to see, and you treated me accordingly. I pulled out another document, a market analysis showing what she should have been paying in rent all these years. Did you know you've been living here for $1,600 below market rate? That's nearly $300,000 in savings over 15 years. I'd say you're the one who's been living off someone else's generosity. What happened next surprised even me. Patricia didn't explode with anger or launch into one of her manipulative tirades. Instead, she collapsed into her chair and began to cry, not the calculated tears she'd used to manipulate David over the years, but real, ugly, desperate sobs. Through her tears, the whole story came spilling out. The house had never been hers. She'd been terrified for years that someone would discover the truth. Her finances were a disaster, and she'd been so ashamed of her real situation that she'd built this elaborate facade to hide behind. I lost everything in the divorce, she confessed, her voice broken. The house, the investments, even most of my jewelry. This place was all I had left, and I was so scared of losing it too. I thought if I could just maintain appearances, if I could keep control of the family dynamic, maybe nobody would notice how far I'd fallen. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. For 8 years, I'd been fighting against a woman who was just as insecure and frightened as I was, but who had chosen to deal with her fears by attacking me instead of facing them honestly. "So you decided to take it out on me," I said, and it wasn't really a question. "You needed someone to be beneath you in the hierarchy, someone you could look down on to make yourself feel better about your own situation." Patricia nodded miserably, unable to meet my eyes. "You were young and successful and confident, everything I used to be before my life fell apart. And David loved you so much, the way his father never loved me. I hated you for having what I'd lost, and I wanted to punish you for it." The conversation that followed was unlike anything we'd ever had before. For the first time in 8 years, Patricia spoke to me as an equal, without the condescension and cruelty that had defined our relationship. She told me about her marriage, about how her husband had left her for a younger woman and destroyed her financially in the divorce. She talked about her fears of being abandoned by David, her terror of growing old alone, her shame at having to depend on family charity to survive. It didn't excuse her behavior, but it explained it in a way that made me understand the depth of her desperation. "I know I can't undo what I've done," she said finally, her voice hoarse from crying. "I know I've hurt you terribly, and I've damaged David's relationship with you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry." The choice I made in that moment surprised both of us. Instead of evicting her immediately, instead of raising her rent to market rate, instead of using my power to destroy her the way she'd tried to destroy me, I offered her something she'd never given me: compassion. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, pulling out a fresh lease agreement I'd had Margaret prepare. "You're going to sign a new lease at your current rent rate, but with some conditions. First, you're going to publicly apologize to me in front of the entire family at your little reunion next weekend. Second, you're going to acknowledge my place in this family and treat me with the respect I've earned. And third, you're going to get therapy to work through whatever issues made you think it was acceptable to treat another human being the way you've treated me." Patricia looked up at me with something that might have been hope. "And if I do all of that," she asked, "then you get to keep living in this house, and maybe, we can figure out how to actually be family instead of enemies." 6 months later, our relationship isn't perfect, but it's completely different. Patricia kept her word about the public apology and the shocked silence at that family reunion when she acknowledged how badly she'd treated me was almost as satisfying as buying the house had been. She started therapy and slowly began to understand how her own trauma had led her to traumatize others. David and I are stronger than ever, finally free from the toxic dynamic that had been poisoning our marriage for years. And Patricia? She's actually become something close to a real mother-in-law, someone who asks about my work with genuine interest and includes me in family planning without being forced to. The Victorian house on Maple Street is still beautiful, still impressive, but now it's a place where I'm welcomed instead of merely tolerated. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies, it's giving them the chance to become better people than they ever thought they could be. Though I have to admit, owning the house doesn't hurt either.